That was the sound of me almost being trampled by some panicky, bee-stung horses near the end of my 4.5-day druk trek in Bhutan. Of course it's funny now. I think it was even funny to Janet, who I hear laughing in the background. When I saw the horses charging like an ostrich, I simply turned around so as not to witness my own demise. In our last episode, number 19, I covered the cultural aspects of the Kingdom of Bhutan, by far the most unusual country I've ever visited. In today's part 2, I'm going to cover our actual adventure, our hike along the old Silk Road from Paro to the capital city of Thimphu, and also a stunning hike up to the sacred Tiger's Nest Monastery. We will also cover other adventure activities available in Bhutan, such as whitewater rafting and kayaking and biking. So stay tuned to this, the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks, and welcome to the Kingdom of Bhutan. I am so glad that I thought to record the horse bells before we finished our trek that day. I think it's funny that I happened to get almost trampled in the process, but the sounds of the horse bells are one of my fondest memories of Bhutan. We were on an assisted hike, which I'll get into a little bit later, but it's the sound of the horse bells, the wind whipping the prayer flags in the breeze, and the chanting of monks that are the sounds of Bhutan when I look back on it. Before we get into the actual hiking, I do want to go over a couple of the logistics that you need to know. So let's get into that. To get to Bhutan, which is a small country about the size of Switzerland, nestled between China and India in the Himalayan mountains, I first flew to Bangkok. There's a huge time difference between North Carolina, where I live, and Asia, so I arrived several days early to adjust my body clock. This gave me a chance to explore Bangkok, a place I'd never been. To get to the only international airport in Bhutan, your tour company can route you through Bangkok, Singapore, or India. Bhutan requires that all non-Indian visitors hire a local licensed guide for their entire visit. So your guide company is going to make your flight arrangements, arrange your visa, and they'll arrange to pick you up at the airport. Indeed, they're going to transport you and be with you the entire trip. The government sets a minimum per diem tourist fee that's all-inclusive except for drinks and tips, your visa, and flights, so you pay the same whether you're camping or staying in a 3-star hotel. You can pay an upcharge to stay in a more luxurious hotel like we did on our last night in Paro, where we stayed in the 5-star exquisite Zawali Ling Hotel, handcrafted in the exacting Bhutanese tradition. It's a stunner, and it's ranked by National Geographic as one of the most unique lodges in the world. Pretty much all tours in Bhutan are custom, whether you're a party of 1 or 2 or a group of 8 like ours. Your tour company can help guide you on activities based on the time of year you're traveling and what you'd like to see or do. Pay attention to the weather averages and be sure to review them with your tour company. Links and recommendations can be found on the free Bhutan travel planners that you can download off the website or you'll get automatically in our monthly added newsletter. Bhutan has an amazing culture, so be sure to allow time to explore it as well. They also have some amazing wildlife, so if you're into animals or birds, Bhutan is a great place to check out, particularly in central Bhutan. I went with a group of hikers, so we wanted to obviously to hike, but we timed our visit to land in Paro for the Seshu Festival. I know I mispronounced that. It's Tshechu, Seshu Festival. This is one of the most popular festivals in this region. And this spectacular event is covered in more detail in the previous episode 19, and also on the website you'll see lots of photos and videos. For the festival, the region turns out in its finest national dress, and the masked monks dance to tell the stories of their history. The costumes are incredible. Staying a couple days in Paro also allowed us to acclimate to the altitude before our main hike. The Paro region is over 7,000 feet, which is high for a sea-level gal like me. On our second day, we did the 2 to 3 hour trek up to Takshang. I'm going to spell that too. Taktsshang, Takshang, otherwise known as Tiger's Nest. This is one of Bhutan's most sacred spots and one of the iconic photos you'll see whenever you Google Bhutan. Tiger's Nest is going to pop up for you. The Tiger's Nest Monastery is incredibly perched up on a cliff about 3,000 feet above the Paro Valley, and it's an architectural marvel. It is said that Guru Rinpoche, you'll remember him from our first episode, flew to the spot on the back of a tigress and then meditated in a cave for 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, and 3 hours. He emerged in 8 reincarnate forms and the site became holy. You may remember Guru Rinpoche from the last episode on the culture of Bhutan. He was the Lama who brought Buddhism to Bhutan in the 8th century. It's a really beautiful hike up the mountain to Tiger's Nest. I was amazed at how some of the older local people were able to even to do the trek. You are, after all, climbing up some pretty significant elevation, about a 3,000-foot elevation gain for the day. About halfway up, there's a rest area with a beautiful view of Tiger's Nest. Here you can catch your breath, have coffee or tea, or even a buffet lunch. They have a little restaurant and a little patio outside overlooking Tiger's Nest up above. In colder weather, you can also warm up by the wood stoves and the indoor cafe. On the outside deck overlooking Tiger's Nest, they cleverly reused soda bottles to make what I guess you would call them like prayer bottles, where they would cut out curved parts of the bottle to catch the wind and make them spin around. Like the prayer flags, these soda sculptures capture the well wishes for all sentient beings, and the wind carries these colorful good wishes out to the world. Further up the mountain, you come to a scenic overlook. This is a great place to take a selfie with Tiger's Nest in the background. It's also a great place to take a quick break before the final push-up, a lot of stairs to the monastery. At this and in all monasteries of Bhutan, shoes, sunglasses, and hats must be removed. In this particular monastery, backpacks and bags are stored for you, but you leave your shoes and hats outside. You're going to need to wear long-sleeve shirts and pants, and I'd also recommend wearing or bring along a pair of socks so you're not walking barefoot in the monastery. Locals are required to wear their national dress, which is very colorful and beautiful, and we covered that in the last episode, but in a nutshell, the men wear a billowy jacket over a skirt that covers the knees, and the women wear a more fitted jacket over a long skirt. You can catch photos of these on the activetraveladventures.com website. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to take any photos inside of the monasteries, so I'll have to try to explain what they look like on the inside. There's always an altar in front of the main Buddha, but depending on the temples, there could be hundreds of Buddha figures or paintings throughout the temple. There's also a meditation and ceremonial sitting area for the head monk, and sometimes mats for other meditating monks. Believers bring food and money to leave for the Buddha. The walls are usually murals of Buddha and symbols painted in the Tanka Buddhist tradition. Students learn to paint in this exacting style at technical school. The Bhutanese are not bashful when it comes to color. The paintings and dress are riotously colorful. Upon entering a temple, a practicing Buddhist will prostrate themselves before making an offering in any of the monasteries. In one of the temples we visited, in fact, the wooden floors where the people would kneel in prostration were carved out by the hundreds of thousands of knee imprints over the course of centuries. Incredible. Temples are often dark, sometimes lit only by butter lamps in a window. The smell of incense hangs in the air. Sometimes you'll see a monk meditating on the floor while a group of tourists visits or locals come to pray, and I kept wondering how on earth can they concentrate with all these people wandering about and talking and whatnot. When I caught my first close-up look at Tiger's Nest on the overlook, I said that as far as I was concerned, if I went home right then, my trip to Bhutan was worth it. Tiger's Nest is truly an amazing sight to behold. I hike for pretty, so I don't mind a hard climb as long as there's a nice reward at the end of the journey. Tiger's Nest is by far the most magical structural reward I've ever received for my efforts. Hiking up the mountain to see Tiger's Nest was a great warm-up for our big hike as well. My group of 8 hiked a trail called the Druk Trek. Druk means dragon, and this trek is the old trade route through the mountains from the capital city of Thimphu to Paro, where the airport is. You can do the trek either direction, but it's a much more difficult trek if you go from Thimphu to Paro, as that first day would mean a dramatic climb higher, or a lot more people will suffer altitude sickness because it's so steep so quickly. The way we did it coming from Paro is much more gentle for a first day's climb, and thus it minimizes any chance of altitude sickness and lets you kind of get your bearings a little bit. In the beginning of our trek, up to around 9,000 feet or about 3,000 meters, the winter daphne is in full bloom. This is one of the most fragrant shrubs on the planet, so its perfume was a welcome addition to the trail. Other early bloomers on the trail included double red ruffled rhododendrons and lilac primrose. I trained for this hike with an altitude trainer called Alto Lab, although most of my hiking partners didn't do anything special to prepare for the higher altitudes. One of my hiking buddies had recommended the AltoLab. He's a performance athlete, and so he uses it for training for altitude as well as for endurance activities. I live at sea level, so the best I could do to train is to look ridiculous hiking around my neighborhood with increasing the weight of my pack each week. Training for other treks, I've been known to join a gym to hike on an inclined treadmill with my pack. On this trail, the Druk Trek, I'm hiking the lower altitude mountains with the views of the greater Himalayan mountains in the background. Our highest elevation was just under 14,000 feet, or about 4,200 meters. On the first day, I felt pretty good all day, but of course I could feel the altitude whenever we had an ascent. However, a husband and wife team in our group was not feeling well throughout the whole morning, and they ended up turning around and returning to Paro at lunchtime, feeling really sad to end their trek that they'd been planning for a whole year. At the time, we all thought they were sick from altitude sickness, but now I'm not so sure, and I'll explain why in a bit. You would not believe the production involved to get our group across this trail. We were doing a supported hike, which means that we did not have to backpack or carry our tent, our equipment, or our food. All we had to carry was our clothing needs for the day and water. They even provided and carried the snacks. No matter the weather, I always carry an emergency bag, plus my thermal jacket and rain jacket, regardless, because if you get wet, sometimes you'll get chilled, even if you're in a warmer climate. And because of the altitude on this trek, I also carried rain pants, thermal mittens, a wool hat, and waterproof gloves. And believe me, in Bhutan, I used all of them, often in the same day. Since I wasn't carrying my gear, who was? The bells. It turns out that our group of 8 hikers needed a support team of 14 horses and a team of 6, not counting our wonderful guide, Chimmy. We had a lead horseman and his 2 assistants, plus a cook and his 2 assistants. Like I mentioned, I'm going to fondly and forever associate Bhutan with the clanging of the horse bells. And I must say, we were all real pleased at how well the horsemen did take care of the horses. You hear sometimes, particularly in Nepal, how sometimes not just the horses, but sometimes the guides are not very well taken care of. On our first day, we arrived at camp around 4 p.m. Our team had beat us, so our full-size tents were already set up and ready for us. My single tent was tall enough for me to stand up in, maybe bent over a little bit, but still tall enough to stand, and had a footprint of, I'm going to guess, about 6 foot by 8 foot, which is significantly larger than my own tent at home. Remember, on a previous episode, I said I was going to challenge my Cootie Queen issues and used the Pro-Offer Tour Company sleeping bag instead of bringing my own? Yay, happy to report, the sleeping bags were new and of good quality. Not only that, but they gave me a real pad instead of my noisy and smaller blow-up thermal rest one. And to top it off, they overlaid the pad with a large oriental rug, which not only added some insulation from the cold, but eliminated the slipping off of the pad issue I often have when I camp with my gear. Plus, I got a full-size pillow and a real blanket. Turns out this was a supported glamping trek. Glamping, if you're unfamiliar with the term, means glamour camping. Not only did the horsemen set up our tents, they also set up a large cooking and a dining tent rigged with battery-operated lights. They also set up 2 small private zip-up latrines, which were tents atop deep-dug pits in the ground for our waste, and one of the tents had a portable toilet seat. When we arrived at camp the first day, we first had tea, and in Bhutan, you drink a lot of tea. I then went to my tent to read and rest. About 20 minutes later, I suddenly felt nauseous. I sat up thinking maybe I was just lightheaded, and I started feeling a little bit better. Then a couple minutes later, I was like, I got to get out of this tent right now. I was violently ill multiple times and felt so sick that I just crawled back to bed when I wasn't ill and eventually fell asleep without dinner. Unbeknownst to me at the time, 2 others in my group had the same issue at virtually the same time. That made the tally of 5 out of 8 of us sick. Since the 3 new sickies happened at almost identical times, when none of us had had an issue all day with the altitude, I believe that we got some food poisoning at the hotel buffet, at breakfast, or at dinner the night before. Fortunately, the sickness for the 3 of us passed by the morning, but we were all very weak from our exertions. I've often wanted to, quote-unquote, test myself to see what I'm made of under extreme stress or hardship. While I can't say I was truly tested on day 2 hiking up that mountain feeling as weak as I was, I think it's the closest I've ever come to being truly tested. All I wanted to do was just see the campsite and rest. Unfortunately, Janet, she the one I think laughing at me in the horse bell audio, another hiker in our group, started feeling nauseous about an hour or so into day 2's hike. It's bad enough to hike when you're weakened from being sick. I cannot imagine hiking that day feeling nauseous. If it were me in her shoes, I think I'd be able to say, on that day, I was tested. I do not know how she managed to make it, so kudos to you, Janet. Thus, by the end of day 2, 6 out of 8 of us had been sick. Frankly, I can't really tell you whether day 2 was pretty or not because all I wanted to do was get it over with. The night before, we had hail and rain, which then turned into a snowfall of about 1.5 inches. We also enjoyed a full moon that night, and I remember going to the latrine in the middle of the night to get sick, and I was just not well enough to care enough to grab my camera to capture the absolutely gorgeous new fallen snow on our campsite, all in the full moon. It was stunning. But as lousy as I felt, I could still appreciate the beauty. As the sun melted the snow the next day, our path then became a muddy mess, especially because all the horses had trod on the trail ahead of us. Let's just say that day 2 wasn't the favorite hiking day of my life. We finished about 10 kilometers of day 2 at an altitude gain of about 1,115 meters or about 3,500 feet. And again, I want to congratulate Janet on that. I don't know how she did it. On day 3, our tummies were unsettled, but we're still no longer sick. Hallelujah! We had slept below the Jelizong Monastery, and so we climbed the hill and poked in for a peek before beginning the day's hike. As I mentioned on our last episode, we went to a lot of monasteries, and each one are unique. This one was particularly serene as it was so remote and therefore much more quieter, and we were the only visitors. And now on day 3, we're starting to really see the Himalayan range, glimpsing it between the mist and the clouds. Our third day was a beautiful trek. Plus, while trekking along, we looked up and suddenly there was a herd of yaks with a few of their babies. After a little bit, the yak herders came looking for them. The weather wasn't cooperating, so we made the executive decision to take a lower trail rather than climbing ever higher in the snow. At our elevation of about 12,000 feet or 4,000 meters, we'd seen snow and hail each day, so we were not going to climb higher with the accordingly higher depths of snow. That night, our camp was overlooking a stunning lake. That's when I found out that in addition to tall mountains, all lakes are sacred to the Bhutanese. I'm not sure if it's all Bhutanese or all Buddhists, and I apologize if I get some of my interpretations of what I did learn wrong for any of the Bhutanese or Buddhists listening to this. All I know is that the Bhutanese do not swim in their lakes, fish for the large trout in them, or make loud noises around lakes. Once again that night it snowed, creating a picture-perfect setting along the lake and the mountains. And when I say snow, we're not talking blizzard snow. We're talking cute fairyland snow where it was quite pretty. I posted a great photo of our camp in the snow at activetraveladventures.com/Bhutan Adventure. Gratefully, there's one other piece of equipment that came with our camping gear. Each night, the cook would boil water and fill up a hot water bag to keep us warm. We could just put those hot water bottles in our sleeping bag and keep us nice and toasty. On night 3, it was pretty darn cold, and I'm not sure I'd have been able to sleep without that delightful bag. In fact, I'm going to add one of those to my car camping gear. They are wonderful, and most nights, actually, they still had a little bit of warmth left in them in the morning. That night, I could hear a horse just outside of my tent. Sometimes the horsemen let the horses graze freely, and other nights they were tied up, and I'm not sure what determined which nights the horses got the privilege or not. I never figured that out. On night 3, apparently, the horses could graze, and there's one just outside my tent neighing a little bit. The next thing I knew, the horse seemed to be spraying my tent violently, much like I would imagine a 1,000-pound tomcat could. Realizing now that I know nothing about horses, even I could figure out after a few minutes that a massive horse could not possibly spray that much. Then it dawned on me that the odd noise I was hearing was the horseman brushing the snow off my tent to prevent its collapse under the weight. Too funny. That reminds me of a night that I spent in Tanzania where it was 90 some odd degrees outside, and I heard a noise outside of my tent that sounded like somebody was stepping on very thin ice, but I'll save that story for a future episode. Some people don't sleep well at altitude. I had no problem whatsoever, which is kind of funny because I do have sleep issues at home. So once my tent had been brushed off, I quickly fell back asleep for the remainder of the night. On day 4, our last full day of trekking, we reached our highest altitude of 4,220 meters. At the peak, the area was full of prayer flags, as is typical for any high pass or bridge that can carry the well wishes for all sentient beings with the wind. Prayer flags are printed pieces of fabric mounted to a long string that have mantras and blessings printed on them. The image of prayer flags is something I will always associate very fondly with my visit to Bhutan, as they are ubiquitous to this Buddhist nation. In fact, I brought one home, and I have that hanging in my porch, and I absolutely love how the breeze captures it. Another thing you see a lot, albeit if not on the trail except at the monasteries where we spent night 4, is prayer wheels. A prayer wheel is something even illiterate people can use to get the same blessings and good karma as the literate. A mantra is spoken internally whenever you spin the prayer wheel in a clockwise direction. Sometimes it's a single wheel, and in that case it's usually quite large and colorful. Other times it's a series of wheels. You can see photos of these charming icons at activetraveladventures.com. So back to the hike. On day 4, we are above tree line, and periodically we get a glimpse of the magnificent massive range ahead of us. On our trek, we don't climb any of the super high mountains. In fact, no one climbs them. It is forbidden, as the tallest mountains in the Himalaya range in Bhutan are considered sacred, so cannot be defiled by climbers. Climbing those kinds of mountains is beyond my capabilities anyway, so I'm content just to see them. As it is, I feel the altitude where we are. I have now climbed over 1,500 feet higher than my previous best, Chiripo in Costa Rica from episode 15. I feel the thin air, but thus far do not suffer any signs of altitude sickness to my great relief. I think that maybe that Altolab thing has helped me after all. However, my friend Els, one of the 2 who did not succumb to food poisoning, does feel the effects of the altitude, and for the first time, she's not the leader of our pack, but instead is lagging in the rear. Our guide, Chimmy, who's done this trek 7 times, is also feeling the effects of the altitude on this leg of the trip. Altitude sickness is not something you can predict. A physically fit athlete can have issues while a couch potato may not. Sometimes, someone who's never had a problem may find, like our guide, that this time they do. Els hikes all the time in mountains much higher than me, and for some reason, whatever the combination was, that day it just wasn't working for her. The best thing to do in altitude is to hike very slowly. Go slow to allow your body to adjust. If you're able to take it, take ibuprofen to minimize any headaches and drink plenty of fluids. In the case of severe altitude sickness, you need to get down lower immediately. Usually all altitude sickness symptoms go away as soon as you reduce your altitude, or as your body adapts. Severe altitude sickness is not something to be messed with, so don't be a foolish hero if you should show any kind of severe signs. In Costa Rica on Chiripo, I had a minor issue with a mild headache, but really had no problems on this trip except I was just sucking wind whenever we were climbing. Nothing too bad at all, though. One thing to consider if you do decide to do this trek, you need to decide whether you want to see the festival, which is usually in March or April, the date of which is determined by the lunar calendar, or to try to time it to hit the dwarf rhododendrons in full bloom in late spring, and that's going to depend on how early spring hits the area. The mountainside above tree line is literally covered in these dwarf rhododendrons. I'm told in pink, white, and purple. And I could just tell it would be stunning, and I'm really sorry I missed it, as they were just budding up when we were there in early April. If you time for the blooms, you'd probably also miss the cold and snow if you go a little bit later than we did. I went at the change of season, which is naturally going to be a little bit more predictable weather-wise. That extra month or 2 allows spring to stabilize a bit. You just want to make sure you go before the monsoon season starts in mid-June through mid-September. October would be another good month to go. So take advantage of your tour company's knowledge to choose a suitable time to visit. Our last night in the mountains, we stayed on the grounds of a monastery. I'd gotten so hooked on a memoir of an American woman who moved to Bhutan to teach English called Beyond the Earth and the Sky by Jamie Zeppa that I was resting in my tent reading when some of the others went to explore and got to see the monks playing football. Soccer to me. That had to be a sight. One of our group was invited by a monk to watch them do the evening prayers. Lucky you, Dean. I'm sorry I missed that, but I would recommend that book if you're interested in Bhutan. I found that it helped my Western mind wrap my head around the whole Bhutanese culture a little bit. On our 5th and final trekking day, we headed on a steep downhill down to the capital city of Thimphu. Going down that steep hill, I was really glad we were going downhill on our last day rather than trekking uphill on that in the first day. So remember, go Paro to Thimphu, not vice versa. We saw a couple doing the opposite direction, and I'm sure they were suffering for it. This will also save you a little bit of travel time because you're actually landing in Paro, which is the start of the trek. Even though we rarely saw other trekkers on the trail, we often saw their horse entourage. Whenever the much faster horses were coming, we were supposed to get on the mountain side of the trail as opposed to the cliff side, so in case the horse knocked us down, it wouldn't accidentally push us off the mountain. Because I so associate the horse bells with this trek and my trip, as we neared the end of the trail, I thought it'd be cool to record the horses as they passed us, to add a little flavor to this podcast. Like I said, whenever we heard the horses, we hugged the mountainside, and I did. There was this really small little path behind me that looked like occasionally a horse or wildlife might parallel the main trail, but I wasn't really worried about it. What I didn't know is that the horses had disturbed a bee or a hornet's nest, so they're all agitated and scared. So when I hit the record button, little did I know I was about to record what could have been my final trampling. Listen again and see if you can hear when I'm about to get squished. Yes, you're right. It's right before what I'm pretty sure is Janet's laugh. But in her defense, it was funny. Happily, none of us got hurt, and we did get a good laugh at me almost recording our crushing. An hour later, we were safely off the mountain, and we were greeted by those who got off the mountain early due to sickness. Our welcome included a tablecloth-covered table that we were going to have tea and cake, but the raindrops soon started to fall, so we quickly headed to the van. And our driver, Tashi, who we could always count on to get us safe and sound through the winding roads. We faced illness and almost all kinds of weather Mother Nature could throw at us, yet we're all still glad we made the trek. It's hard to decide whether to choose to see the rhododendron blooms, which would be absolutely stunning, or the festival, which was one of the coolest and most unusual things I've ever seen. So you're going to have to pick one, depending on what your priorities are, or do what I plan on doing, is do it again and hit the other one that I didn't do the first time around. The weather wasn't the greatest on our trip, but it really wasn't a hindrance, and the snow was really pretty. Like I said, it was only just 1 or 2 inches, so it always made everything look fresh and pristine, and it wasn't overly cold. It was just there. The Druk Trail itself, while challenging, is not overly difficult. If it weren't for the altitude, I'd call this trek a 3 or 4 times out of 5, but because of the altitude, I'm going to give it a 4, and for some people it might even very well be a 5. It's just going to make just about all of us suck wind. But the Druk Trek is not the only long-distance path. There's 8 other trails that I'm going to list on the website. Some are really, really challenging, including the most difficult trek in the whole world, the Snowman's Trek, which is way, way far out of my league, and it's quite a dangerous trek that I wouldn't recommend for anybody that I know. Anyhow, for less strenuous hiking, you can also do a cultural trail and hike from village to village. Those are listed as well. At Dakala Pass, one of the scenic overlooks on our way to a village called Panaka, we ran into some trekkers who did a different trek, the Jomathari Trek. This trail is actually the beginning part, which is a safer but still an endurance trek part of the aforementioned Snowman's Trek. For experienced long-distance trekkers, this might be an option for you. In addition to hiking, you can add some whitewater rafting and or kayaking to your visit. If you're staying just in the Paro Timpu region, you can choose the mild Moku River with its gentle Class 1 with an occasional Class 2 rapids. And this is a river suitable for kids, seniors, first-timers, and bird watchers who want to look out for the rare white-bellied heron. Or you can choose the more popular and more rigorous and exciting Pochu River Run with Class 2 to 4 rapids. And on both of these, you're going to raft to where the two rivers meet at the 17th century Punakazang, the Palace of Happiness. This is a fort-cum monastery that is also the king's winter office. If you want to see even more wildlife and jungles, and even spend the night in a jungle camp, head to central Bhutan. There are many paddle options on the Mangdi and the Dangdi rivers, with a variety of calm or exhilarating runs. You can see a list and description at activetraveladventures.com/Bhutan-adventure. On the upper Mangdi River, you'll get breathtaking views of the Royal Manas National Park on the right, with a chance to see rare Bengal tigers, the cool-looking golden langur. This is a gold-colored primate with shockingly fanned-out facial hair that looks like it stuck its finger in a socket. Rhinoceroses, water buffalo, hundreds of species of birds such as the popular hornbill, plus elephants. Then, if that's not enough, on the left side you pass a typical Kangup village settlement. If you can, go for the all-day paddle, which runs the lower Mengda through the jungle as well. And if that's not cool enough, it's a rollicking river of exhilarating Class 3 plus rapids that's going to keep your blood pumping all day. A good family trip with the kids would be the half-day Dangda River that's pretty calm with only a couple of Class 2 rapids. On this river, however, you can opt for a 3-day trip with an overnight stay in a jungle camp. How cool is that? My sister Terry and I did a jungle stay in Costa Rica, episode number 15, and it was one of the highlights of our trip. On the Dangi River, too, you're going to see the Royal Manas National Park with its beautiful flora and amazing animals. On paddle trips, indeed all Bhutan trips, you want to avoid monsoon season, which comes in the summer. Otherwise, most rivers can be run year-round, although you're going to get cold in the winter on the river near the Palace of Happiness. Like most places, it seems spring and fall is the best time to visit. Sometimes it's time-consuming to get to the rivers, so a trip listed as all day may mean it takes a day to get back and forth for an hour-and-a-half run. However, you do get to see the beautiful countryside, so it's not bad, but it's just something you need to be aware of when you plan your trip. If trekking and paddling aren't enough, with all the hills and mountains in Bhutan, not to mention the extraordinary cultural opportunities, you can also cycle Bhutan. Whether you preferred road cycling to cities and villages or off-road mountain biking, your tour operator has got you covered. Most trips have you cycling about 40 to 50 miles per day and include some cultural stops. Depending on the trip that you take, you can climb and descend 1,000 feet per day, and others you may be doing 3,000 feet per day. So in either, you want a good level of fitness, but make sure you're frank with your tour company about your capabilities, and they can provide you with a bike or you can bring your own. For a small country, because of the rugged terrain, it can take a long time to get around, so you may want to choose to concentrate on one area of the country. For example, on this trip I did the Pero Timpu region, but next time I go, I'm going to go to the central areas so I can visit and paddle around the Royal Manas National Park. I want to go see the animals and the birds, as well as the jungle. As I mentioned earlier, the Bhutanese government sets a minimum daily tariff. Sometimes the adventure tour companies are going to be higher than the set per diem, but your tour operator is going to review this with you. You cannot book a flight or get your visa until you book your visit with a certified Bhutanese tour guide. My recommendations can be found on the free travel planner for Bhutan that you can download off the website, or you'll get automatically in next month's newsletter along with the helpful travel tips and sometimes some deals. The travel planners list not only my recommendations, but links to weather, State Department recommendations for safety and travel in a particular country, budget, who the trip is suitable for, any particular cultural notes such as for Bhutan, appropriate dress, a currency converter link, language and communication difficulty rankings, plus a translator link when available, and a recommended itinerary, plus much more. All this is on a 2-sided printer-friendly page that gives you a snapshot of the information you need in order to plan your trip. Active Travel Adventures doesn't accept any advertising so that it can give you some unbiased recommendations. I do, however, seek out companies that I know and trust for my recommendations. And with some of them, I've arranged a partnership where at no additional cost to you, if you use my links on the website or in the travel planners, I might get a small commission. And these commissions help defray my costs of running this program to keep the podcast and the website going. So I'd like to ask you, if you're going to book or buy something I'm recommending anyway, please show a little love and use the links on my pages. It really does help, and I'm really grateful. Thanks. If you haven't done so already, be sure to listen to part 1 of my Bhutanese coverage. It's episode number 19. You can find the link on the directory page or just go to activetraveladventures.com/19 or /Bhutan. And remember, that's Bhutan with an H, Bhutan. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the amazing and mysterious Bhutan and will plan to visit it before the rest of the world discovers it. You'll find the people friendly, the landscape and wildlife incredible, and the culture beyond anything you've ever seen. Be sure to share this episode with a friend. It's the best way for others to find out about the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'd be so grateful. One other thing. I want to do some interviews of before and after of people that have never gone on an adventure trip. I just remember my sister Terry's from the Costa Rica episode 15. You could just hear the excitement in her voice and the confidence that she got from doing that adventure. And I see from the surveys that some of you have gratefully filled out for me that many of you have never traveled yet and you're still just kind of thinking about dipping your fingers into it. If you're one of those people, please reach out to me at kit@activetraveladventures.com or just hit the contact us button on the website. I'd love to talk to you and interview you for a future episode because I'd like to see the before, the things that you're worried about, and just go a little bit about that, and then interview you when you get back from your trip. And let's take a look and see what that's like. I just think that would be really cool. So if you fit that bill, please reach out to me, and let's get that started. In the meantime, in our next episode, we're heading to Europe, to northeast Italy, to visit the magnificent Dolomites, considered by many to be the most beautiful mountain range in the world. Our internationally well-traveled guest describes her adventures there as the perfect trip. She says it was a perfect mix of action and culture and food, and I can't wait to share it with you. I'll be back in 2 weeks with Andy's Dolomite Adventure. Until then, this is Kit Parks, and I thank you for listening. Until next time, adventure on.